I first began teaching in the public school, which is a point I need to make because when I first learned about teaching grammar and taking advanced grammar classes in college, you guys come on in. There's still empty seats here and there, and some on this side too. And they're making more copies, so they'll be right back in with those. There's still seats. There's still seats. There's two over here too. So when I began in teaching public high school, we were given a grammar textbook, and then here's your American literature book, and you have to teach all of this in 1 year. Here you go. Good luck. That was it. That was it. And even my mentor teacher in the public system was like, so try to do a few of these exercises every week, and I don't know, cover 100 pages in the textbook every week or so, and by the time you get to the end of the year, you'll be done, and that's all you need to do. And it was one of those things, oh, so it's just a checklist and that's considered teaching? That was my first exposure. But what I found out in the years of teaching a grammar textbook was that I did not see results in my students' writing. And yes, they were turning in exercises and they were filling out, at that time, the most common one out there, and some people still use it, is a Warner's grammar. And so you did your 10 sentences and you rewrote them, or you did the right subject-verb agreement and you turned it in and you got a grade. But the problem with that system, other than the obvious fact if you've done it for a few years that way, is that it does not actually trigger or connect to how students communicate and especially how they write if we actually teach it that way. So I think after 3 years of teaching public high school, I was at my wit's end going, this is not working. I actually want to see my students improve in the single year that they have me. And that's when a friend mentioned to me, oh, hey, there's this book out there. This Michigan public high school teacher was frustrated too. And she started doing a lot of studies on this and experimenting in classes of every age, like about 5th grade and up. She began to experiment with grammar instruction, what worked and what didn't. And so she wrote a book, Teaching Grammar in Context, back in the early 90s, and then did a follow-up book with even more practical applications and lots of exercises for every age range that you can think of, for every grade. And that particular book, I have that one here. This is the 2008, but it says Grammar to Enrich and Enhance Writing. And I can't remember which one I have at the top of your handout, if it's her first book or her second. It's this one. Because this one has the summary of her philosophy and how she implemented things in a very realistic way. It's absolutely hands-on. It is not complicated. And it's one of those books that when I read her updated version, and she has since, Constance Weaver has since passed on, when I read the updated version, I'm like reading the pages going, yep, yeah, I agree. I mean, the whole book, I was just nodding my head, you're right, we have that problem. Yeah, oh, that would be a good idea. I mean, the whole book is that way, and it's a really amazing structure. So I thought we would begin with some of her principles. So on your handout, although it seems wordy, these are like her principles for this is how she sees grammar. And I don't know that I agree with all of it, but she has the most comprehensive, Constance Weaver has the most comprehensive view of what integrated grammar looks like. So if you haven't used that term or heard integrated grammar, it's used more often in foreign language study, because when you learn new words or a new conjugation, the first thing you do in foreign language is immediately put it into conversation. So when you have a short 10-minute lesson by your French teacher, you then apply it and turn to your partner and you have a 10-minute conversation using what they just said. And then that night's homework is based on the same thing, and you put it in writing what they just taught you without actually using the word grammar, which is one of Constance's points I think you might actually agree with. She's all for take the labels off, forget the labels. That doesn't help anybody except give you a way to talk about something. So integrated grammar is just that, not isolating it because that remains in short-term memory, and they have lots of studies and lots of science about that, but to actually apply it immediately in personal writing or dialogue actually doubles the retention. You actually remember what you were just taught. So we're going to take turns reading her 12 principles. So we're going to start in the back of the room. So number 1, would you read number 1?
Teaching grammar divorced from writing doesn't strengthen writing and therefore wastes time.
Number 2, let's go right down the row.
Forgot my glasses. Okay.
Oh.
Few grammatical terms are actually needed to discuss writing.
You can actually just say pass if that happens, but
Sophisticated grammar is fostered in literacy-rich and language-rich environment.
Grammar instruction for writing should build on students' developmental readiness.
Grammar options are best expanded through reading and in conjunction with writing.
Grammar conventions taught in isolation seldom transfer to writing.
right down the row. Let's just stay in the same row.
Marking corrections on students' papers does little good.
What? Keep going.
Grammar conventions are applied most readily when taught in conjunction with editing.
Instruction in conventional editing skills is important for all students, but must honor their home language or dialect.
Progress may involve new kinds of errors as students try to apply new writing skills.
Grammar instruction should be included during various phases of writing.
And more research is needed on effective ways of teaching grammar to strengthen writing.
Those are her 12. She sticks to them for decades, and really they are time tested in so many grades. But here's the thing, from a classical education standpoint, we're like, does that work? Does this work? If we got rid of labels and we integrate and all of that, is that part of what philosophically we should attempt in any classroom that uses language? This is not confined to literature. It's in any subject that you teach that applies and uses writing where you see grammar mistakes and you're like, I wish I could fix that. So my history teachers at the school I used to teach at, it would always come to me and say, hey, in these essays we're still having these problems. Would you please review this rule with the students? And I'm always like, and you can do it too. It's not just the English teacher, it's not just language arts, it's that we all see it together. If students are writing and students are speaking in every subject, then they should be able to integrate grammar in every subject. Not everyone agrees with that in practice, but it sure would be helpful if we did. And that's one of the things I would always encourage my fellow teachers to do. I'd say, well, I'm happy to give you a mini lesson and you can just do it on the board for 5 minutes with your history students if you see something in their writing that you want to help with. So in classical education, though, what's really common if you read all of Weaver is that her principles are echoing Charlotte Mason's. And it's uncanny, the resemblance. And I am sure Constance Weaver had no idea who Charlotte Mason was, had no clue who she was as an educator or knew anything about that school system. But on your handout there, I left a few blanks for you. So you can have fill-in time if you'd like. But Charlotte Mason's grammar principles that she taught were never taught, grammar was never taught as a separate subject. I mean, it's a word that we use to try to communicate it, but she used the concept of imitation, that's number 1, because she would give a phrase or a poem or a quote from a political address that the students had learned or memorized with something else, but also use it to go subject and verb. What's a subject and verb? And they would use that. So imitation was her number 1 practice, and number 2 was review, and number 3 was fastening. And if you haven't used the word fastening when it comes to learning, it simply means there's an immediate application required of the student, typically for a grade or even some kind of, even an oral grade would work, but you immediately assign it in homework or you're immediately practicing it in work time at the desk that you have in that moment so that what you just heard, that individual brain has to apply right away in order to retain. And for Charlotte Mason, it was just a constant process. Everything was imitation, review, and fastening. And of course, it applies to every subject and every type of writing structure that you might have. So, oh, I don't have that. Could I borrow someone's handout? There's a Charlotte Mason quote, isn't there? Do you have the master? Yeah, that's even better. Thank you. This is the way Charlotte said it. As knowledge is not assimilated until it is reproduced, children should tell back after a single reading or hearing, or should write on some part of what they have read. And so narration is probably the most common thing you've heard before concerning Charlotte Mason, that when something was assigned or something was read aloud, then the child narrates back at any age what they heard. It's their version of the story, whether they're 6 or 16. Narration is a constantly evolving process as a student's learning capabilities continue to acquire their language skills. And so narration at age 16 is really long and involved because they notice so many more details. And narration at age 6 is something very simple. The goose ran down the hill and then fell into the creek. I mean, it would not be complicated. So narration is the telling back, but as I included from her quote, you can also write on something that they have just read to draw attention to it, and so that actually cements into your memory and into your learning. So I left some blank space there for you because I wasn't sure how many of you know a lot about Charlotte Mason's philosophy. How many of you have read any of her 6 volumes? I know, it's a lot. It's really great when your kids are little or your students are little. There's so much hands-on help that she provides, but let me at least read a little bit to you so you have an understanding of how she looks at grammar, because it's very parallel to what Weaver does with grammar as well. So she did not recommend that we teach parts of speech or rules during the younger grades until 4th grade. Those were the years to lay the foundation of good English usage in conversation, narration, copy work, which is imitation, just copying a model and putting in your own words, and then also the living books, which is her phrase for the great books, books that live and survive and continue. The premise is learning by example and modeling. By grades 4 through 6, Charlotte introduced the parts of speech, beginning with simple 2-word sentences to teach the concept of verbs. And literally, I just wrote it down from volume 3. Mary sings, Auntie knits, Henry runs, and she would give labels so students would understand them. She didn't give a lot of particulars about teaching the parts of speech because she didn't use a textbook. She would incorporate selections from the stories or the history she was already using. So one of her well-known examples is one of Christina Rossetti's poem. She would give them one stanza to copy for handwriting practice. And then as soon as they were done, she would ask them about the parts of speech, because they had just imitated and they had learned a little bit about Rossetti. And then she'd say, what is each word in the sentence doing, or each word in the line doing, and simply draw attention to it, and that was it. And it was short. That is the key. Mason kept it short. 1 to 2 minutes talking about the parts of speech over just a few lines. That was it. It was not drawn out. There wasn't a fill-in-the-blank worksheet that came after this. That was all it was. And it was every day, several times a day. You just talk about it. It's incorporated. It's integrated in. I did read that Mason also included some word studies. She taught things like prefixes, suffixes, synonyms, antonyms, homonyms. But again, she didn't label them. She didn't call them grammar lessons. She stressed integration in all subjects. You read good literature, living books. You learn vocabulary naturally through context and exposure. And students would continue oral narration through all grades and add written narration by grade 4 or maybe 5 if they were ready to write back. Like you read a short story, and then instead of telling back what you think happened in the story, you would then write it down. And the older students would begin to write longer sentences by that point. And it was just part of reflecting upon what you read and what you heard. she says that we should not dampen a child's response by correcting them as they speak to us or as they write. And most of us are very much used to the way we learned, and even if we're trying to unlearn the way we learned, many times we realize when we use it on our own students, it's not very effective. So I don't care if it's a red pen or a green one or a bright pink one, but our editing marks on their writing don't actually produce a lot of results unless we're sitting there one-on-one with them. And that's something that Charlotte Mason agreed with. She felt that if you are correcting them as they speak, and it's part of an assignment, they read the story and they're supposed to tell it back to you and you're correcting them, it does no good. All it does is teach the student that they didn't notice the right thing. But is that actually true? Her point was that every mind is unique, and what they notice in a story will come back in a unique way. And if you're correcting them because they missed the major plot point, then the only thing you've done is discourage them because they realize they got the wrong point. But did they get the wrong point? And that's what Charlotte Mason would ask. She would ask you to be more flexible, which in a classroom is difficult because you want everyone to understand the story the same way you think. So that's a whole other workshop. So she says, the few hints by no means cover the disciplinary uses of a good school book. Let us be careful that our disciplinary devices and our mechanical devices to secure and tabulate the substance of knowledge do not come between the children and that which is the soul of the book, the living thought it contains. Science is doing so much for us these days. Nature draws us close. Art is unfolding meaning to us. The world is becoming so rich that we are a little in danger of neglecting the art of deriving sustenance from books. Let us not inhibit the children. Let us not in such wise impoverish our lives and their lives. All from Volume 3. So this integrated approach that Weaver advocates very much echoes Mason and the same concept, the same philosophy of integration. So on the second page of your handout then, you can follow along. Weaver says, teaching grammar to enrich and enhance writing is teaching grammar as possibility. We see it as positive, the offering of options rather than the avoidance of errors. We see it as productive, especially in the sense that it produces effective sentences and paragraphs. And so, eminently practical. So her strategy does not need a grammar book. It simply takes time on the part of the teacher. And this is the nitty-gritty part, probably the part you came for. So the second part of the handout here where there's a lot more blank space is for us to fill in and work through some examples together. And you can see sort of how I have tried it out and experimented with my classes over time to see how this actually works. So I used to, instead of giving grammar 5 days a week or 3 days a week, and you have these exercise A and B to finish and turn in by this day, I used to do that and didn't see anything other than a number in my grade book. I honestly did not see a change or an improvement in my students' writing, so I quit doing it at the same time I began to read about Weaver's application. So number one, her application is utterly flexible, and it's one of the best strategies you can ever adapt, because you can adapt grammar review to any level class that you have, whatever level of learning you have. And I don't even like the label level, but whether you need students who need a lot of remedial help, or they just transferred in and your class is this far in their writing and their abilities and you need to catch someone up, this type of review works. It just does, because it's completely based on what you notice in the student. So number one is not about grammar rules, but it's Weaver's number one rule, and that is to teach something repeatedly, which we all know because we see the same mistakes, and so of course we repeat the instruction, realizing that it may be better understood and more completely applied with more guidance. So at the beginning, this is what it looks like in real life for me. At the beginning of teaching 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th, 11th, or 12th, the 5 grades I've taught, I do the exact same thing. Whatever the first assignment of the year is that comes in writing, whether it's a paragraph, an essay, a summer reading assignment, any of those types of things, before they actually turn it in, I tell them I have a few things I want them to review, and I just cover a couple things on the board. So this is what it literally would look like, probably in 8th and 9th still. I would probably just do that and then say, hey, if I don't want to see the pronoun I, what else do you think I don't want to see in your first paragraph that you turn in to Mrs. Norvell? And then we'd make the quick list. Oh, I don't want to see me. I don't want to see my. Oh, yeah, and you guys don't do you and your. Let's just keep it third person. Everyone's always like, what is third person? Don't worry about it. Mason and Weaver would tell you, forget the label, drop the label. Just say, I don't want to see I, me, my, you, and your in the first assignment that you turn in to me. Just hold them accountable for that. Because where you start on the first day is what you're going to hold them accountable to for the rest of the school year. Unless you say, we have a narrative, and you are writing a personal account. You are now, for the first time ever, released to write in first person. And then they'll still say, what's first person? But the label is not actually needed. So something like that is similar to what I've begun with. Depending on the type of assignment, if I ask for something descriptive or something reflective or something based on what they read, I might actually go make a list of words to myself that I typically have seen too much of. And I might give them a quick list and say, hey, you guys, I don't want to see the adjective good. I don't want to see the adjective nice. And I, for sure, the rest of the school year, don't want to see the word very. Use your thesaurus. Find another adjective. What's more descriptive? What's another word that you could use? And in Weaver's book, she has some really practical examples on getting her students to produce things for her. So she begins, I think as early as 3rd grade, with what she calls a personal poem. And she gives each of the students a little picture or has them look out the window, pick a single object, and they're going to write a poem about the object. And she tells them, your poem is going to be 4 lines. And you're just going to write any thought. She doesn't even say sentence. Doesn't have to end with a comma. She doesn't add any restrictions in any label to say, your first sentence is going to say, I, this. Your second line is going to say this, and it's going to begin with a verb. And this is going to be the pattern that you're going to follow. And then once they've created that first one, and she looks at it, she gives them suggestions that aren't actually edits. She'll just draw an arrow to a word and say, come up with a word that is more than green. Come up with a word that's more than walk. And you can call them verbs and adjectives and all of that, and those are fine because we need some kind of tool so we know what kind of word we're referring to. I understand that, but that's not her emphasis. And so she very gradually, and her book even lays this out for every grade level that she's tried it on. And of course, older students are able to produce much more complicated poems at first, but she's tried it like on every age, and it works. So when she asks for more detail the rest of the school year, they know exactly what she means because she taught them a pattern to follow and then always refers back to it at the beginning of the year. And we can use that whether we start the year with a poem in creative writing, or if I start with simple things, I don't want to see these in your writing for the rest of the year, and I don't want to see these ever. Don't tell me that Romeo made a bad choice. Tell me he made a wicked choice. Tell me something that has more to it, because our students describe things really well when they're talking to each other, especially if something bad happened to them, then they get dramatic. I don't care what age they are, so I know they're capable of coming up with really good adjectives if they're unflattering, and if they're flattering, even better. So those are the types of things that you draw on, and that's how the beginning of the year might actually look like. So that first assignment of the year is critical for me, because each of my classes separately, maybe I have 5 sections. So my first section, I might see, after I've already said, don't use this, and maybe one or two students forgot, and maybe there's a personal pronoun or possessive one in there somewhere. No big sin, no big crime. They're not marked off for it. I just underline it and say, hey, you used your, just remember that. But as I'm reading, I am looking for where they have trouble. So is it subject-verb agreement? Is it commas everywhere but where they should be, which is really common in 9th grade especially. All the time, it's always the commas. Is it the use of hyphens? Is it some random thing? Sometimes, depending on the class, one class will have an issue with one piece of punctuation that another class doesn't. So that's when I begin to tailor what I teach each class and review. And it is more work. But it's actually for each student or each group of students that I have. If I have 15 in a class or 10 or 18, whatever numbers I'm trying to juggle, I can tailor it for each class because I'm not confined and anchored to a grammar text that I have to follow through. I can go, hey, based on their writing, I know the majority of the class, maybe not everyone, but the majority is struggling with this issue. So that's my first lesson of review for the next week. So Weaver would tell us then to teach something repeatedly. So as soon as you teach something in class, you hold them to it for the rest of the year. If they forget how to use a hyphen after you talked about hyphens for a month, you teach it again, and you just keep going. And it doesn't take but a few minutes to bring that teaching back to their mind. But she's like, hold them accountable. Whatever you do, supply plenty of examples. Number 2, since patterns may be deduced from examples, even if our teacher explanations are not well understood. So she talks about, at great length, about how we have patterns in our language anyway. And if you point out the obvious to your students, and I read a study about this decades ago, but it's the idea that you know to say big bad wolf instead of bad big wolf. You know to say zigzag instead of zag-zig. You know not to say cross-Chris. Why? Have you ever thought about that? Have you read about that? This little phenomenon of our language acquisition? Any linguist in here? Why would I not say zag-zig? Come on, somebody give me a guess.
You've always heard zigzag.
That's true. That's what we've always heard. Pardon?
Doesn't it have something with the vowels?
Yes, it is. There's a vowel pattern. I-A-O. Always. It just is. It's just a thing. There's not even a rule. There's not even a book about it. It's just a thing. It's how we speak our English. And there's also a British columnist wrote this. I wrote it down maybe 5 years ago. I thought it was really funny because he said, we actually know this about adjectives too. And maybe this will ring a bell. Maybe you've heard this. He said, adjectives are always opinion, size, age, shape, color, origin, material, purpose. Who's going to remember that? But he said, you can have a lovely little old rectangular green French silver whittling knife. But you would not say a lovely rectangular little old French green silver whittling knife. Because it changes the meaning, of course. But he said there's a natural language pattern in our acquisition. And if we learn to use pattern as a way to pick up on what our students are writing and where they need improvement, and we use pattern naturally, it's easier to apply. It's easier to remember in our students' writing. So I've probably been remiss, but how many of you teach 7th grade and below? Anyone 7th and below? Okay, what's the youngest we might have? Anyone teach 3rd, 4th?
I do. Yeah.
Or if you're multi hats?
5th.
5th? 3rd? 4th. Okay. Above middle school, how many teach 8th, 9th, 7th, 8th, 9th, above? Okay. All right. So tell me a little bit about the patterns you already know by March. We're this many months into the school year. Can you tell me, without even writing it down or looking through a stack of papers, do you know what your students struggle with in each class, each separate class? They still have what is it? I've taught this. No. But the point is, if you can work with the idea of patterns from the very beginning, as soon as you look for that, and it's a very conscious effort on the part of the teacher who's working with the writing, whatever subject you teach, if you can see it from the beginning and begin to use the writing to tell you what to teach versus a book, you can review all the rules, and that does help. There's no question. You can review all the rules and make sure you're very thorough and you apply it in their writing. But if you actually move to where the students need improvement immediately based on what they're producing for you, the results are faster. And that's what I love about the approach. So if we go on then, number 3 says to show examples of a new grammatical skill, but also contrast them with easily confused instances that are not good examples. So we have, I have a lot of examples of those, but I'm sure you do too. So who likes to teach compound adjectives? We'll just start with a fun one. Not that any of us want to work this kind of job. It's just for example, but when you teach compound adjectives, how do you do it? Who can explain it to me? What would you say, depending on the age of student you're trying to teach? Because this is obviously probably not for 5th grade and below. A lot of students will catch it though. What do I tell them so they know what to do with that adjective? Anybody?
We say what kind of shift.
Okay.
Find the adjective, or find the noun first.
Find the noun first, yep. So you could go for the part of speech and say, hey, that's your noun. So what are these doing?
Yeah, then you ask what is the job of the adjective?
What is the job? And that's actually Charlotte Mason 101. What's the job? What is its function? Function is such a weird word though. That's an adult word. What is its job in the phrase? It's not even a sentence. So, and the other one that helps my students, I'm like, so what kind of shift is it? Is it an hour shift? Is it a 4 shift? Oh, hey, is it a 20 shift? No, Mrs. Norvell, it's a 24-hour shift. It's like, yes, this is describing that. We did it, yay, hyphens, right? And so then you test them. So then I will just come up with a few, and I'll have you all come up with a few. If I said, you have a beet red face. Let's do a number. Oh, and here's one you see in the grocery store. Okay, so you can probably come up with a few more. A beet red face. What is the job of the 2 words in front of face? Is it a red face? Is it a beet face? And of course, you can come up with fun ones that the kids are like, no, it's a beet face. That sounds awesome. But they have a beet face. We made a new word. But beet red obviously works together. You won't always see it punctuated correctly on the cartons, but are they free eggs or are they cage eggs? So that hyphen is very functional for us. And then this is always fun because when you're still teaching students every now and then, or just whenever it comes up in the school year, numbers under 100 we write as a word, but numbers 100 and over we write as a number. And you've reviewed that maybe, so what if you combine the two? And it's funny, whenever you add numbers to compound adjectives, most students are like, wait, isn't there a rule about the number? What are we supposed to do with that, and they think it's a trick. So I just use the same premise. Is it a page book? Is it a 500 book? No, it's a 500, right, so it looks weird, but it's a 500 page book. These 2 words go together, and our hyphen is actually very helpful for us that way. So there are a lot of fun examples of how hyphens are critical. I I thought of a really awful one that was on Twitter a few years ago, where someone used the word first, but it wasn't connected the right way to an adjective, and so it read something completely inappropriate because they actually needed a hyphen on a tweet, and it really changed the meaning of the sentence. But obviously in our classes, we want to come up with ideas that would make sense to them and how even a hyphen can improve a sentence in our communication. So if I was doing this in class without a textbook, I would already have, and I do have, a whole file folder, just sheets of simple, quick examples now that I've done this a lot, over 10 years now. And I'll just have a few examples on the board right when they come in. And I don't do this every day of the week, maybe 2 days a week at the most. But whatever it is I'm working on, because I realize everyone's completely forgotten what hyphens do and how they work, I'll have 4 examples on the board. And then we'll talk about it. And then, as we're talking about whatever we read, whatever the lesson was, and say, because I've done this one so many times with my 9th graders, I'll say, so when you're answering your questions for Romeo and Juliet, Act 1, Scene 5, and you answer those questions tonight, would you be sure to use at least 3 hyphenated words? And whoever sits next to you tomorrow is going to check that you actually used your hyphens. And because all good students like to get their neighbor in trouble, the next day when you exchange papers, it's like, Mrs. Norvell, this one's wrong. You know, and you come over and you check, and most of the time they're right. But it's one of those things that you just help each other learn, and you don't do it for a grade. It's just, hey, we reviewed hyphens. Let's apply it. Let's figure out how to actually use it, and use it right away. What's even better, and what Weaver would tell you to do in her book, is don't even wait for that night. If I said, hey, here's a hyphenated word, I would choose some hyphenated words that actually apply to what I'm immediately doing in class next. I would find a hyphenated word or 2 or 5 in Shakespeare and what we were going to read in class, and write a line of Shakespeare with a hyphenated word, because he uses tons of compound adjectives. And as we read it, and we'll talk about it, and I wrote the line, say, hey, look, Shakespeare used a compound adjective. What about that? And we can immediately apply it. And then I could also ask them to write a sentence using one immediately, just one. You're not going to turn it in. You can just keep a running notebook of rules and examples and things that you imitate and copy. You can hand out sheets of paper. You can have all kinds of things that you can use in class that are not textbooks to help them remember something that you're trying to review in class and hold them accountable to. But again, as Weaver would say, if you teach it at the beginning of the year or the 2nd or the 3rd or the 4th month, you keep up. You the teacher, don't forget that you have told them how commas work. And this is what we're looking for. So, speaking of Romeo and Juliet, you should have a final sheet, and we'll come back to Weaver's rules, but you should have, it's actually just an overhead that I had that I just made the copies. I didn't even make it small. But what I do from time to time that Weaver recommends you do is you take examples of students writing, you just don't put their names on it. But it's so funny. Even if it's a bad sentence with several errors or a good sentence, students are still like, oh, that's my sentence. And I'm always like, I didn't tell you to say who wrote it. Here it is on the overhead, old school, here we are. And so I usually have to review for a number of students how compound sentences work. Compound sentences, anyone, your favorite, right? It's one of those things you have to teach so many times in so many ways, and I have tried maybe 5 different methods. So I'm going to show you what I like that happens to work mostly. I don't think anything works for 100% for all your students. But if I were starting, we would start with these guys, with younger students, especially 6th grade and up maybe. I don't know. Anyone taught fanboys other than me?
6th grade.
6th grade, yeah. That's about the good time to do it. So, anyone else know what fanboys are? Anybody know? Say it, say it. Conjunctions. They are your coordinating conjunctions that connect your independent clauses. Words that Weaver and Mason would never use. They don't. So, for anyone else? and, oops, nor, but, or, yet. So, there they are. So I'm looking for those. I'm not even teaching the semicolon connection between two independent clauses yet. But I always tell the students, we're going to look for these first. And I always have them label and highlight a sentence that they've already written. So the way I've done it before is they wrote a 4-paragraph essay based on a question I gave them about Romeo and Juliet, some part of the play. And I said, you need to have a subject and a verb. You need one of the fanboys and a comma, and a subject and a verb. That's it. That's the pattern. So remember we talked about imitation, and you can teach imitation a lot of different ways, but I give them the pattern, and I say, in your essay, each paragraph needs to have one compound sentence. And I want you to go ahead and label it. And I don't care if I have 12th graders or 6th graders. I make them label. You can do color coding. You can do all kinds of things. There are all kinds of other kinds of writing and grammar instruction styles that use this type of thing. But I'll say, that way, I can check it or your neighbor can check it, and we're going to look for these sentences. So they'll turn in a rough draft to me. I'll look for this, and then before I hand them back, I throw 5 or 6 sentences on the overhead and said, hey, before I give this back to you, because we're still working on using commas well, here we go. Romeo reveals to the friar that he loves Juliet, comma, and soon after, Romeo finds out that she also loves him. Is it a compound sentence? Yay, yes or no? Did they fail? Did they pass? Most everyone would go, yes, that works. But what's and soon that? Or soon after? You know, so we talk about the variety there. But that sentence passed. Then we have, as the story progresses, however, she becomes a rebellious young girl who rebels against her father. Also, she becomes desperate. Wow, most students are overwhelmed with, wow, the story progresses. However, and they're like, that's a great sentence. And it's like, find it. Did you find it? Can you find the parts? And everyone's like looking at the overhead and looking at the board, and they see my marker, and I'm like, where's the fanboy? Oh, it's not compound, but there's so many words. Yeah, but then it's like, but so many words doesn't make a compound sentence. Here's a short one. She sat and she stood. There's your compound sentence. So the others that we look through, what's great about using the student sentences is that you can see the types of things that they can create and how much work they're actually doing in crafting a sentence. So look at Mercutio. He is a headstrong, willful, and comical character, and his dear friend Benvolio is not the same at all. In fact, countering him in many ways. Participial phrase points, but the only thing I'm looking at is one error. They forgot the comma, right? But everything else was great. You can do S and V and underline your fanboy and oops, the comma. That was all. Juliet would most likely be alive and married to Paris. There's the comma. And we're all shaking our heads, no, because we need a subject. And honestly, when I just have the simple parts listed like this for them to label, it's easier for them to go, oh, look, there's a verb, but there's no subject near it. That's not right. And they can correct it themselves. And then the last one. The nurse is essential to the audience because she reveals many things about Juliet that we wouldn't know otherwise. It's a good sentence. It's not compound. And then everybody was like, oh, isn't the B for because? No. So rewrite the sentence. What can you change? What can you keep? And we work with it from there. Now, if I go through this many sentences from a rough draft assignment, obviously that's going to take me 10 or 15 minutes in class. This is not the quick 2-minute quick review thing. But when you're using their productions and what they have thought and written themselves, it's immediately applicable because number one, they're making corrections on their own papers if it was one of their sentences. And number two, Other students are then looking at their, oh, I thought that was compound. I think that needs a comma, and that one doesn't have a fanboy. And they look at it differently, and I didn't use a grammar book. And I'm not talking about independent clauses. I still might use the phrase. I mean, most of my students, I can say, hey, this is an independent clause and a coordinating conjunction and an independent clause. But honestly, what advantage is the label? It's a way to talk about it. I understand that. And when parts of speech are there, that's great. But Weaver and Mason both would say, drop the label. Some of us would go back to, just like you do in grammar school, can it stand alone? Could it be a sentence by itself? Or is it a complete thought? Those ideas are still there. Yes?
I have a question about that.
Mhm.
I struggle with, as the teacher, you're supposed to have mastering your, whatever you're teaching.
Mm-hmm.
So in the sense of, we don't need necessarily to use the labels to describe how to do it,
Mm-hmm.
but we also need to know the labels. So it's so odd, like, I don't know how to describe it, but why would I not then give, just because of confusion, I guess, is what I'm asking?
Yeah.
Even though we need to know it, so
Right.
we don't tell them, we just need to know it.
Right. So, I mean, their point is take away as many names for things as you can. And in fact, when they come in the classroom, one thing Weaver says, never start the class period. We're going to do a grammar review today. Don't use the word grammar. Don't even use the word grammar. Get rid of it. Don't use the label. We're going to review how to write this today, because all of the grammar learning is applying it to your writing. And if your focus is the writing, why do you keep hammering the word, we're going to do a grammar blah blah, a grammar this, a grammar that? Don't even use the word grammar. We're going to learn how to write this today. We're going to learn how to write words that describe nouns. We're going to learn what homonyms are. Do you remember what homonyms are? Homonyms are fun. Let's write it. I mean, there's all kinds of labels that you keep, but there are plenty of them that you can drop, and I'm still learning to drop them because I learned old school and I used all the grammar, everythings, and never helped my ACT. I don't know how it helped anybody else, but anyway, the test-taking game is a whole other idea. But we only have about 10 minutes left, and I want to leave a little more time for Q&A, so we still need to talk about number 4. Weaver says to applaud new learning, the trying out of new things grammatically, even when the learning is partial or incomplete. Applaud new learning. So if I had a sentence on that Romeo overhead that was one of the best written they've ever done, and they just simply forgot to put the coordinating conjunction in, I can still applaud the fact that they were very descriptive, they included the characters, they talked about it well, and let's just add one thing to it, and then it's a perfect sentence. That's a splendid sentence that you wrote, but you're not negating in any way the entire thing because they forgot a comma. To say, that's an awful compound sentence. No, it's not. It's got everything but one component that I want to add in. Let's just add this in, and you've got a perfect compound sentence. I'm so glad you wrote it for me. So number 5 then, she said, accept and welcome the new kinds of errors that come with experimentation and risk-taking, not to downgrade the writing or the writer, which is exactly the type of idea I just explained. So new kinds of errors is, I know you've seen this, especially when students are still acquiring language use in the early years, is that we're not even talking compound sentences, but maybe if they're still struggling with subject-verb agreement, whatever all those exceptionals where like everyone is, everyone are, which one is it? How do I know? But everyone is a lot of people. Shouldn't it be are instead of is? Those kinds of things. Sometimes students, would we say the word overcorrect? Or they create just a different thing that's like totally out of your toolbox, and you're like, how did you come up with that verb? But the point was, Weaver would say, but they're trying. They're trying to model, and they know a different verb is needed there to agree with the subject. They just haven't fully learned that it should be is instead of are. So be patient with the new kinds of errors. Applaud the fact that they are actually making a change and they know there needs to be a change there. So don't correct them for trying, but do say, this is how the original pattern is. So let's look at this again and just repeat. And you go back to number 1. Let's teach something repeatedly. And you keep going until it starts to stick when they apply it in their own sentences. So there's a lot more to Weaver's book. There's plenty of helpful information in it. I can't recommend it enough. And it doesn't look like they're going to do any kind of new addition to it. But whether you teach elementary, middle grade, or high school, she has a lot of great things that are easy to incorporate immediately in the type of writing and instruction that you're already giving. And so it's like one of those top books I've ever read that just, it works for me, it worked for my classroom. I'm still learning how to master it. And I really love not using a book. I really like just using what the students are creating so that I know how to model and I'm following their patterns and being flexible and oops, we're having to repeat this again, but that's okay. Because I'm going to teach it repeatedly because I want you to learn how to master a sentence and write a beautiful phrase. So questions, especially because we have a mix of level and teaching. Yes?
There's a comment on her principles about marking corrections on students' papers. Can you unpack that a little bit from your perspective?
Yes. She lays out an entire chapter on it. And her view is you only mark what you're teaching at the moment. Even if you have 20 errors in a paragraph, you're only holding them accountable to what you've actually taught immediately. Not for everything you should ever know to make 5 good sentences in a row. And so I would say, if there was a better phrase for it, she would call it light editing. It's only for the things you're actually teaching in the moment. And of course that builds through the school year.
So what does that look like later then in a school year once they're already, they have this compound knowledge and they hand in a paper and sure, this week we taught compound sentences, but they already know all the other things. What does that look like?
Well, hopefully if we're doing our job well. There's still not a lot to mark because they've been acquiring the information and the application through the school year. And by the time they're getting through the first semester or so, we are seeing improvement in their ability to communicate and write sentences well. And they're not perfect yet, but we've been correcting just a few steps along the way, and we're just building onto it. And so we're not really, if I'm grading something now in the month of March, I'm not grading everything I've taught because they've already acquired it. Does that make sense?
Would you not mark it then? If you do notice that maybe which class is not?
Well, if they've forgotten something, I hold them to it.
Okay.
That is the accountability still, but you find you're not as marking as much. If you're trying to be that thorough person. I always had thorough English teachers that you're just like, whoa! I'm just like, that was so much work. Did I learn anything from it? No! A lot of marking just makes me feel bad. No. Teacher and student. So that's more of her premise, if that helps. Other questions? Applying this.
Okay, you mentioned not to be confined to a grammar text, but I'm sure most of us, a lot of us, have a surely grammar text.
Yes.
So, thoughts on, I mean, I'm kind of wrestling in my head, how do I do some of these smaller things outside the book? Mm-hmm. But would she say, not use that book at all? I mean, what would you say?
Weaver would say, don't use the book at all. She wouldn't even agree with grammar curriculums. But what's interesting is that surely grammar is an integrated approach. So it's a matter of adapting to the philosophy at each school, like what's required and what's part of this. Because you can still use surely grammar, but not be as reliant upon the book and the exercises, where it's just you whip out your book, you turn to the page, the kid knows to do this or to do that. But you can also break that reliance and say, okay, we're going to use something we learned last week from the book, not open the book at all, do a quick exercise on the board, try not to use the word grammar. But when it's part of surely grammar, how do you not know? How do you not say the word grammar?
Maybe just see it more as one resource.
Mm-hmm.
Amidst.
Or her simple explanation is, we're going to work on this aspect of our writing today. Whatever age level you deal with, you always talk about it. We're going to improve this thing in our writing today. And that's how she avoids the word. Anybody else?
Well, so I'm just, I mean, what do you do with, I teach 5th grade, which is, so I'm okay, but how do you, I mean, they can't necessarily write much when they're in 1st grade, so how are you, I just can't even imagine not teaching what a subject and a verb are. I mean,
You will.
You would still do that.
You still use parts of speech labels as you need to.
Okay, but just
Simple
again,
ones.
not focusing on them, not doing the grammar, and then the writing, but the grammar and the writing kind of is that. Okay.
Yeah, and one of her exercises later is, since most of us learned independent and dependent clause work, and then adjectival clauses and noun clauses and all. Did anyone ever really remember all of that? I mean, even as adults, you're laughing because I'm the same way. I'm like, now what's a noun clause again? Do you need to know what it's called in order to write a clause? No. If I say start a sentence with because, you're going to finish it till the thought finishes. Do I need the label on the clause? Not necessarily. And that's their point, because sometimes technical things like that, they sound an adverbial, an adverb clause. Some of that is off-putting, and it sounds complicated. And when you read it in a grammar text, it's really complicated. But if I just use the imitation principle, and I'm like, oh, look, Shakespeare wrote a because clause, and I write his phrase, and I'm like, okay, you guys write one. Where does the comma go? Great. This is another way for you to use variety in your sentences, so all your sentences don't start with a subject. That's your writing hint for the day. And I didn't have to say, this is a this clause. Does that make sense? So it's skewing how you look at it or talk about it too.
Along with like the teachers, having the mastery, and we simplify it so that they grasp the concept. My initial reaction is, because I want to master it in a way of I know it, so I can then, because you can't really simplify something unless you master it.
Right, agreed.
So my question is her book comprehensive enough so if a new teacher is coming into our school and they have had grammar growing up and whatever, but then of course they haven't sat down and haven't done this in a while.
Yes.
That I can be like, here, have this book. This will help unpack what we're expecting, because we also use Shirley, and it's very
ordered,
very orderly,
progressive. Yeah.
If you are walking in and that's not your strong point, you can sit down and be like, okay, I have this concept, and that's what I'm just curious with her. Is she that comprehensive?
Yes.
Okay.
She is. Yep, she gives lots of the technical parts and say, in your former teaching life, you would have called it this. And she says a lot of witty phrases like that to lighten the mood, because she's trying to get, the whole goal is to improve our students' writing. And so if you just see grammar in a different way, it just helps how you explain things to students. It's not as overwhelming. So we're out of time.